of linguistic landscapes specifically. Before I move on, I should say that due to shortage of time and to the format of the presentation, I'm using a limited number of concepts that I haven't really properly defined on the slides and I haven't given references for. These are concepts like dispositive, style, audience design, scaling, upscaling, and composition. So if you have questions on these, please ask me at the end or send me an email. I'll be more than happy to provide elaboration or references. So the COVID outbreak in February in Europe, in February and March last year, found me preparing 2 spring term courses on linguistic landscape, a teacher training seminar on schoolscapes, and a lecture on language in public space. Both these courses are part of my linguistic landscape engagement here in Hamburg for the last 3 years, and both are supported by a digital research tool, LinguaSnap Hamburg. This is a localized version of the original LinguaSnap web application that was developed in Manchester some years ago. LinguaSnap Hamburg has 3 parts: a smartphone app that allows to photograph and annotate signs. These are the screens from the smartphone app. With a 14-point annotation scheme that integrates categories from various linguistic landscape frameworks. The second component is a database where signs are stored on a university server and can be checked and released to the general public, and an online map. This is what you see below, where the geotagged photos are displayed and can be researched based on a number of categories, the same categories they were annotated with. Note that we're using the same tool to do schoolscape research in Hamburg, which is, however, not my topic today. As teaching moved online last spring, I used this tool to foster student engagement with COVID-related science as a part of my lecture and my seminar, and students eagerly grasped this opportunity to reflect on how the pandemic transformed public space. These were teacher training students at BA and MA level, but also students of other course programs. And thanks to the enthusiasm of my students and my team, we now have around 700 fully annotated photos of COVID signs that are now publicly available on the LinguaSnap Hamburg online map. So if you go to the map and then type in the title Corona, then you will see these signs and you can check each of them and their coordinates and their information. I've used this database in my spring term teaching, and I've also started using it as a research corpus as well. In a first analysis last summer, I examined parts of this corpus to identify functions of signs, of signage, in the pandemic dispositive. I thereby used the notion of dispositive, a concept from Foucauldian discourse theory. This is the idea, basically, that power is exerted in modern societies by means of configurations or assemblies of discursive, non-discursive, and material means. For example, public space is regimented by means of signs, like prohibition signs, stop signs, and things like that, but also by fences and by the layout of roads and pavements, which control and organize the movements of people, the movement of bodies in certain ways. So discursive, non-discursive, and material means work together in regimenting public space. This, very simply speaking, the idea of the dispositive. Now, thinking signs and linguistic landscape research into this concept emphasizes that the dual property of signs, of being part of a discourse to the extent they include signs, verbal and pictorial signs, but also being part of the material world of our built environment. I suggest in this paper that signs are in the center of a rapidly expanding reorganization of the public space in the spring of 2020 and ongoing, of course, and propose 3 function categories along the lines of geosemiotic classification by Scollon and Scollon 2003. The first is regulation. So signs are obviously very important in regulating public space. We have seen closures of parks, closures of playgrounds and things like that. We have also seen these sort of makeshift, make-to-do regulations. So these are lines to enforce distance, physical distance between people as they wait to be served or to grab coffee or whatever. So regulation is the first category that's very important for the landscape. The role of science in the landscape is positive. A second category is information. So for example, in March and April 2020, we saw a lot of these signs, handwritten letters, basically. This is in the front of an ice cafe, an ice cream parlor, and it says, "Dear ice fans, Corona does not stop in front of us, and for this ground, the authorities have requested that we close the shop. This measure takes place for your protection and our protection. When the situation has bettered, we're going to be again for you there. Stay healthy, family Stefani, Ice Cafe de Fanti." So it's a whole letter explaining the situation because of this very rapid, very unexpected closure mid-March 2020 here in Hamburg. Here's another piece of information. So if you follow the geosemiotic approach by Scollin and Scollin, these are sort of surrogates for commercial signs. So they are attached onto facades, but they do not attract people's attention to something to buy, but they just attract people's attention to the impossibility of doing a transaction, or the possibility, the unlikely possibility of doing a transaction. So it says the kiosk is still open for you. And the third category are affect signs. So these are mostly transgressive signs in the usual definition of the term, but signs that basically express affect, express feelings towards the public or towards certain public servants. So this one is a handwritten note and taped on a post box, and it says, "Dear postman, thank you, loving thanks for you providing us still with post." Exclamation mark. Okay, I also emphasized in that paper the makeshift and improvised design and materiality of many COVID signs, private and official ones, during the first wave of the pandemic in early 2020. So this is a metal plate sign in front of a school, and this is another, the usual one, and this is another sign by paper taped on, so overlaying the first one with the indication of closure because of Corona and all the dangers. And this has been again defaced by somebody saying this, the paper here shares important notice, and it has been negated into unimportant notice. So this happens in front of a school, and this is one of the most important drugstore chain in Hamburg. And in the first weeks of the pandemic, they posted up these handwritten signs to ask people to wear a mask. So these signs were produced in the first week of the pandemic in a state of emergency and with no underlying standards. They did not follow any particular convention. And this is very obvious with official and corporate signs that aim to regulate public behavior. Note also regarding the interests of your group that the overwhelming majority of these first wave COVID signs were monolingual, so they only used German. So even though the semiotic landscape of Hamburg is very multilingual and very varied in that sense, COVID signs of the first wave were almost exclusively in German. So using German as a lingua franca and disposing of other languages for the time being, at least. In this paper, I present work in progress that focuses on a subset of COVID signs in the Hamburg corpus, requests to wear a mask. In the first months of the pandemic, scientific evidence suggested that mask wearing, covering mouth and nose, together with physical distancing, are the most effective measure to prevent virus spread in everyday life situations. So mask wearing became mandatory during last year in Germany, as in many other countries, for a variety of settings. First, for closed public spaces, premises, for public transport, and increasingly also for open air sections of cities. And as wearing a mask became a sort of universal measure for virus spread prevention during 2020, related signs have also proliferated. The relation between these signs and human action, so people masking up or not masking up, is understood here in a social constructivist perspective, as already indicated with the notion of dispositive. So public signs, which in turn consists of an arrangement of linguistic, of verbal and pictorial signs. So these public signs contribute to the social production of space. They make up an important part of perceived space, the social space we jointly perceive, and they also play a role in the way social space is individually experienced. So when people say that we have a corona dictatorship, part of their experience is all these new regulatory signs that tell them what to do, to wear up a mask and things like that. The data and analysis I present in the following are work in progress. I cannot emphasize this much enough. We started out coding with 45 unique signs photographed by students and project teams members in Hamburg. The large majority of these were photographed in May and July. During and towards the end of the first wave of the pandemic. These photos are made by my students, most of them, and not just by myself. So it's a bit of crowdsourced data here. An additional set of data from the second wave was collected online, and I'll say more about these below. The analysis follows roughly 3 research questions that draw both on linguistic and semiotic landscape research, but also 2 ideas from discourse theory and sociolinguistics. The first research question takes its cues from my general first finding that COVID signs of the first wave are very inconsistent and improvised and very varied in their forms. This leads me to predict that face mask signs as well will display variation in wording, pictorial illustration and composition. So this is a more descriptive question, and I'll talk quite a bit about this. A second hypothesis takes its cues from sociolinguistic and pragmatic theories of style, understood here as socially significant accomplishment of communicative action. So extending the first hypothesis, I expect that differences across these signs in wording, illustration, and arrangement might pattern in socially meaningful ways, for example, in terms of speaker design, that is the style of the sign indexes the social identity of the sign producer, or in terms of audience design. So the style of the face mask sign indexes the sign maker's awareness of their addressees or of their audiences. A third question concerns the change of masking request signs over time. So I examine where the language and image relationship have changed between the first and second wave of the pandemic as concerns these signs. And my hypothesis here is that semiotic change entails a reduction of message content and semiotic form. So the idea is, the preliminary observation is that more recent signs, the signs we see coming up this winter, have less words and they say less, and they are more standardized in their semiotic and their multimodal makeup than the signs from the first week and months of the pandemic. So let's see how that works and whether that works. The analysis draws on a multi-level coding scheme, and basically I'll present this to you with examples that covers all 3 basic dimensions mentioned above. So we have the verbal part of the sign, and there I look at the speech acts and at the linguistic expression in terms of word choice and of syntactic constructions. We have the pictorial part, and then I classify or subclassify in terms of image content, and we have the relation of the 2 in sign composition, where I draw from Crescent van Leuven's ideas about composition and the composition of visual space. So let's move on with analysis and a lot of examples and analysis. And I mainly focus on question 1, but I'll say also a bit about question 2 and question 3. Now, when it comes to the verbal part of these face mask requests, what do they actually say in words? We see the following patterns in the data. A lot of signs actually express a requirement, so they express the obligation. These are very often impersonal constructions with words like like obligation, Pflicht, or mandatory. So you'll see this word many times in what follows, the Maskenpflicht, mask obligation. So many of these signs basically say there is a mask obligation in this store or in these premises. A second category are bitte requests, please requests. So these are requests with the word bitte that basically hedges a little bit the request and turns it into a polite request. There we have various constructions there with a finite verb. So bitte tragen Sie eine Maske, or in the infinitive, bitte Mund und Nase bedecken, or even without a verb. So visitors and deliverers, please with masks, something like that, or please enter or store only with a mask. A third category are, commands. So these are imperative or infinitive constructions. So constructions that don't use any polite hedging, but just say mask up. Okay, masks up says here. And here it does say liebe Kunden, and it does say bitte here. So there is a polite hedging, but when the instructions come, they come as commands. Maintain physical distance, put on a protecting mask, disinfect your hands, and things like that. And we have indirect speech acts, a few of them. So this is basically an expressive, nice to see you again, even if it's with a mask. So it's an expressive that is basically a request. The request is masked as an expressive. Combinations of these are possible, and we find a lot of combinations. For example, Yeah, so these are various combinations, especially when you have the image-centered layout. You have combinations of a required and a polite request, or a requirement and another requirement, and you see a lot of this keyword here, the Maskenpflicht, the mask obligation. This one is nice, and it shows you to what lengths some people go and how complex these signs could become in the first wave. So these are signs by public stores. Here it says mask obligation is not just for heroes, alluding to comic strip culture, but also here with us. Please set a mask up. Thank you. So you see, this is a polite request, but if you look only at the colorly exposed part, it's also a command. So depending on how you read this semiotically and where you lay the boundaries, this can be coded both as a command and as a request, hedged by the expressive at the end. In the pictorial part, this is a bit more difficult to organize, and we're not really yet done. In all cases, the absence of pictorial elements is an exception. Out of these 45 signs, 5 come without a mask image. So the coding here focuses on how a mask is represented visually. One possibility is that you see just the mask with accompanying text. So we have one instance of a photograph mask, and then we have mask drawings with various degrees of abstraction. We have a lot of masks on emoji faces. This is by the transport services in Hamburg, and this is by a private store. We have the most populous category is a mask on a humanoid head. So it's a face or a head that is abstracted out and reduced in detail. These have no eyes. So the main criteria of classifying them as humanoids is that they have no eyes, or they have just knobs for eyes, but there is a variety of different representations here. So this kind of industrial flavor drawing has been very common in Hamburg and elsewhere. So, and then finally, we have a few cases where we see human faces. We have one instance with a photograph of a person wearing a mask, but we also have a few cases of these drawings. So these are much more like human faces. They're drawn, but much more like human faces. So it's not really clear-cut, as you see, but there are different iconographic patterns. I'm not really satisfied with that. Maybe you could classify these images in a different way, maybe by provenience, by origin. So you have industrial design, and then you have emoji culture, and then you have a comic culture with these Superman masks and so on. Anyway, when it comes to composition, here we code the position of the mask image relative to the relevant verbal components of the message, roughly following the dimensions of composition established in social semiotics. So the idea that you have contrasts in visual space between top and bottom, left and right, and center versus margin. One main pattern of composition we see in these images in the first wave is text on top, image on bottom. Now look at these, text on top, image on bottom. The text often comes as Maskenpflicht, but also in other wordings. And then you have an image that has all the pictorial variety and variation you showed before, you've seen before. So in social semiotic terms, this positions the mask as real. So this is the actual thing you should put on. And the text, the verbal text, is the ideal. That's the main message. Verbal is the main message. The image is the real. A second pattern. So you see these three have the commonality that they are rounded up by a company logo. This is a company logo, organization logo, but these bits do not express a COVID-related obligation or command, a speech act, they're just a company logo. Another frequent pattern is image center. There is a bit of text at the top. This is almost invariably, when you have this pattern, you almost invariably have Maskenpflicht. This is a signal word that works as a sort of a headline. The mask is in the middle in various graphic solutions, sometimes featuring additional text. You see how there is a redundancy of semiotic cues here. Here it says where responsibility. And then you have, at the bottom, you have some more text. This is, again, a repetition of the request in a more polite form or another expressive, etc., etc. And the most common pattern is Maskenpflicht, and then the image, and then a polite request with a shop logo sometimes at the bottom. And we have some other patterns. So there's a lot of visual and compositional variation. Mask on top, text below. These used to be very few in the first wave. Mask left and text to the right, and even mask as a separate sign. So this chap here, this fellow here, did a sign, and then he added on a mask on a separate sheet of paper, maybe to make it more easy to visually cue. So there is a lot of variation. There are some nice examples for audience design. So we see this is in front of an Arabic supermarket, right? I mean, you have a few of these. There are a few examples that give off information about the producer. So this one and this one. So you have, this is nice German, but they have some subtleties that are not completely idiomatic. So you wouldn't write laut Gesetz ist Maskenpflicht. So it's a bit clumsy. So you can guess that they have German as a second language there. And so this is information given off rather than intentionally indexed. And we see a lot of creative solutions in the private domain. So you see these are all bottom up shields or signs. And some of them play with intertextuality, some of them play with composition. They try to be creative. Not all of them. So you don't see this for banks or for schools, but you do see that. And here you have a very vernacular high mates and something like that, very vernacular terms of address. Now, but we can't see any directionality of change. So basically, it's very varied and all over the place in that part, in that first wave. Now, are there any ongoing changes in the multimodal design of regulation during the pandemic? And if so, what is the rationale? Why am I expecting that there might be any changes in the public display? So what is the rationale behind that? One part of the rationale is the fact that common knowledge is now available. We see this in the first wave of the pandemic. We see a lot of signs that are very wordy, very verbose. They try to explain things, just like the sign I showed you before from that ice cream parlor. So they put this striking, unexpected thing into words to explain to their customers what has happened all of a sudden. Now, as common knowledge is available and is now sentimented, there is no need for such verbosity. So we can, that is one relevant rationale for change. Another rationale is standardization. We see that COVID signs and face mask signs of the first wave were produced as single signs on a shop-by-shop basis. Now, in the second waves, we see signs being produced on a larger scale for the demands of public and private organizations. So, in Jan Blommert's terms, we have a sort of upscaling in sign production, in text production, and this upscaling seems to go along with some standardization in the semiotic structure of signs. So, signs that are produced in large numbers have to be standardized in order to be producible. And a third idea is here that because of standardization and because of sedimented common knowledge, the semiotic change that is to expect is reduction. So we see less variation, we see less verbal tokens, less signs on the sign. Given that the Hamburg collection by my students stops in early October, samples from samples for the second wave have been obtained by other means. I have been doing screenshots of news images with official mask request signs from the start of the second wave, and I did a Google search like the one you see here for images tagged with the word Maskenpflicht from Germany, uploaded last month. So I took some of these images for the following. So this is a bit biased, of course, because I already given the word Maskenpflicht, but I found out that if I type in the word Maske, I don't get any signage. I just get the mask as a Google image result. So the only keyword that gives you signage is actually Maskenpflicht, which is interesting. So these additional signs, so these signs, I took them and they have been subject to the same multimodal analysis as the first wave signs. Now, comparing these additional signs, and I'm coming slowly to a close of my presentation, comparing these additional signs with the LinguaSnap corpus for the first wave leads to 4 preliminary insights. First, a crucial aspect of semiotic change is the restructuring of the pandemic dispositive. Differently said, the upscaling of regulation to cover the face and the face, not just for closed spaces, but for open air spaces as well. So all of these say mask obligation in the pedestrian zone, right? And this here as well. And you see how they are placed. Now, these new regulations that extend the pandemic dispositive to open air are now, or the mask dispositive to the open air space, are communicated with a new generation of face mask signs. The replacement now indexes a much larger scope. It's not just a shop, it's a street or set of streets. These signs are official. They're top-down in our old-fashioned terminology. They're mass-manufactured, they're standardized, and they are of different materiality. We do see some laminated signs like these, but we also see in the second wave a lot of signs that are cast on metal plates in the usual material of authoritative official signage in public space. So as mask wearing extends to open air spaces, its provenience, its origin, its materiality, and its scale of replication all expand. Second, this scale shift, that is the regulation of open air space when it comes to mask wearing, rather than the regulation of access to singular closed spaces, this scale shift goes hand in hand with a slight re-indexicalization of audience. We see a lot of bilingual signs in the second generation in German and English. So the addressees are thought of as a diffuse international audience. So, so it's all of you residents and any international visitors who happen to be here, cover your mountain nose. So this is quite a difference to the scarce but much more specific multilingual signage of bottom-up signs in the first wave. Like you have the Arabic supermarket, they post the mask sign in German and Arabic. You have the German kebab store, they post in Turkish and German. So these are much more diffuse in audience design, cover just about anyone on the streets. So these bilingual signs have one pictorial element, but they have the duplicate as a verbal element. So you have the repetition of the same content basically, but interestingly with different linguistic constructions. You have the German Maskenpflicht and you have an English imperative with invariant wording. So this is just about the only invariant thing in the second wave landscape is cover your mountain nose. This is the official English translation. Third, we see that standardization and mass manufacturing take place not at the federal level in Germany, they take place at the level of communities, towns or urban administration units. And we see very little cross-city consistent. This is in former East Germany, this is close to the Dutch border, this is close to Frankfurt, this is close to Hamburg, northern Germany. So each town does a different thing, basically. And some towns basically take the sort of the industrial pattern and they make their custom-made metal plates, or maybe they buy the metal plates. Other cities seem to employ graphic designers to make corona face mask signs, shields just for them, equipped with a logo, etc., etc. So the variation that shapes COVID signage generally is, in a sense, doubled here, as urban authorities themselves become signage actors. Each town does it differently. Now, finally, last point, how does this impact on the choice and arrangement of words and images? This is not very easy to answer, but what I can see is that we have one standard lexical item. So this Maskenpflicht has already standardized. This is the Q word for this kind of signage. We have a range of additional speech acts like bitte, polite requests, expressive, vielen Dank, thank you very much, and others. And the tokens per sign become less because Maskenpflicht has now established as a standard. There is generally less wording per sign than in our first wave data. And we have two prevailing patterns of composition. The most frequent one is image top. Remember that these image top signs, there were just a tiny minority in the first wave. Now these are the most common, pattern, visual pattern in this second wave signage. And note how these conform with official sign patterns. So what I see here happening is that the face mask signs requests basically are molded into the established patterns for traffic signs. If you see that, that's a very common abstract visual pattern, but it doesn't have the bike rider here, it just has Maskenpflicht. And you see the image, so the ideal is now the image that's foregrounded, and the real is the verbal content that exemplifies the image. When we have image-centered designs, we have Maskenpflicht on top and some translation or additional information at the bottom. But this pattern affords a bit more verbal elaboration. So you find more words when the image is in the middle. You find less words when the image is on top. That's, I think, it's interesting. And in this pattern, we have some leeway for other top line elements. So here it says everyone for everyone, and from here on Maskenpflicht, etc., etc. So to conclude, face mask signs from the first wave display variation in wording, pictorial illustration, and composition. A few combination patterns occur repeatedly, but there is a lot of one-off solutions. There is no standardization whatsoever. Second, we see some face mask signs by private enterprises that are styled in socially interpretable ways. So they use colloquial language to reduce distance. They use language choice to index a particular set of customers, or they draw on, for example, comic strips. They use intertextuality to allude to cultural knowledge. So to tie up this new signage to cultural knowledge. Evidence for semiotic change at the transition to the second wave is related to a shift in authorship and an upscaling of the dispositive. So the spatial extension, so the extension of face mask obligation extended to public space, to pedestrian zones, etc. Many respective signs show a new composition pattern, image on top, that was not prevailing in the first wave, and they do show a reduction of verbal content, though there is still much variation at a city or town level. Finally, what does this tell us about linguistic landscape analysis in general? I think this is this kind of analysis in the hope that you can see that it is transparent enough. It shows the strengths of the geosemiotic approach to the linguistic landscape. It shows the strengths of a multimodal analysis of the linguistic landscape. So not the decontextualization of the verbal parts, but an integrated multimodal approach. And we also see the strengths, I think, of crowdsourced and publicly available data with a web application such as LinguaSnap in this case, but there are also others, of course, that make these data available and transparent. Please ask your questions. I would be delighted to have feedback by the audience. Thank you very much.